alien heart had one doubt, and only a human could answer it. The weight of silence. The asteroid mining station, Helios 7, drifted through the void like a mechanical prayer, its hull scarred by decades of cosmic debris and industrial ambition. Inside its rotating rings, gravity pulled at everything with the persistence of old habits. Coffee stayed in cups, feet found floors, and conversations happened in the spaces between the hum of life support systems. Zara Okafor pressed her palm against the observation deck's reinforced glass, watching the slow dance of mining drones as they carved precious metals from the asteroid's heart. 3 months aboard Helios 7, and she still couldn't decide if the view was beautiful or terrifying. Perhaps both. As the station's lead xenobiologist, she'd grown accustomed to things that defied easy categorization. Still can't sleep? Marcus. Webb's voice carried the particular weariness of someone who'd been working double shifts. The engineer appeared beside her, coffee mug in hand, his reflection ghost-like in the transparent aluminum. Sleep is overrated, Zara replied, though the dark circles under her eyes suggested otherwise. Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on our guest. They both turned toward the far end of the observation deck where a figure sat in perfect stillness. Theon had been there for hours, motionless as carved stone, his crystalline skin catching and refracting the station's ambient lighting into tiny rainbows that danced across the walls. The Vorthak diplomat was beautiful in an utterly alien way, 7 feet tall with limbs that seemed to flow like liquid glass and eyes that held depths no human had yet learned to measure. 3 months, Marcus muttered, and he's spoken maybe 20 words total, all through translators, all formal protocols. You'd think he was allergic to direct conversation. Zara had wondered about that too. The Vorthak were known for their philosophical nature, their tendency toward deep contemplation before action. But Theon's silence felt different. Not thoughtful, but weighted with something heavier than mere consideration. Maybe that's just how they process things, she offered, though uncertainty colored her words. We're still learning about them. Are we, though? Marcus set his mug down with more force than necessary. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like we're the ones being studied. Like we're specimens in his little experiment. Before Zara could respond, footsteps echoed across the deck. Dr. Neela Patel approached with the measured pace of someone who'd learned to read the emotional temperature of a room before entering it. The station's psychologist carried herself with quiet authority, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun that somehow made her seem both approachable and formidable. Couldn't sleep either? Neela asked, joining them at the window. Apparently it's contagious, Zara said. We were just discussing our enigmatic friend over there. Neela followed their gaze to Theon. He's not sleeping either, hasn't moved in 6 hours. How do you know he's not sleeping? Marcus asked. For all we know, that's what Vorthak sleep looks like. Because I've been watching, Neela admitted. It's my job to understand the psychological dynamics at play here, and something about his behavior pattern suggests conflict. The word hung in the recycled air between them. Conflict. It was what they'd all been dancing around for weeks. The sense that something fundamental remained unresolved between humanity and the Vorthak delegation. The trade agreements were progressing smoothly. The cultural exchanges proceeding as planned. But underneath it all lay a current of unfinished business that no one seemed willing to name. What kind of conflict? Zara asked. Neela considered her words carefully. The kind that comes from having a question you're afraid to ask. As if summoned by their conversation, Theon stirred. The movement was so subtle that a casual observer might have missed it. Just a slight shift in the angle of his shoulders, a barely perceptible turn of his head. But Zara caught it, and she saw the moment when his impossible eyes found hers across the deck. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Theon rose with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements and began walking toward them. Marcus tensed. Well, this is new. Theon's approach was unhurried, deliberate, like someone who had finally decided to cross a bridge they'd been staring at for months. His feet made no sound on the deck plating, and the rainbow patterns cast by his crystalline skin grew more complex as he drew closer, as if his emotional state was somehow visible in the light itself. He stopped just outside normal conversational distance, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to maintain the careful boundaries he'd observed since his arrival. When he spoke, his voice carried the musical quality common to his species, but underneath the melody lay something rawer than they'd ever heard from him. "Dr. Okafor," he said, and Zara felt a shock of surprise at being addressed directly. "I have observed your species for 93 of your standard days. I have watched you work, argue, laugh, mourn. I have seen you make decisions both wise and foolish. But there is one thing I have not seen, and I must know." He paused, and in that silence, the entire dynamic of the room shifted. Marcus straightened, his engineer's mind racing to analyze this unexpected development. Neela leaned forward slightly, her professional instincts engaged, but Zara found herself held by Theon's gaze, caught in the gravity of whatever question had been building inside him for 3 months. "You humans," Theon continued, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "You form connections so easily, so quickly. You trust before you have reason to trust. You hope despite evidence that hope is foolish. My people find this incomprehensible." Zara's mouth was dry. "What's your question, Theon?" The rainbow patterns in his skin intensified, cascading in waves that spoke of deep emotion barely contained. "When you choose to trust someone, when you open yourself to another being despite having no guarantee they will not wound you, do you do it because you are brave? Or because you are afraid of being alone?" The question hit Zara like a physical force. She felt her breath catch, felt the weight of not just Theon's gaze but Marcus's and Nyla's as well. This wasn't a casual inquiry or a cultural exchange. This was something that mattered on a level that transcended species, that cut to the heart of what it meant to connect across the vast emptiness between minds. She began, then stopped. The easy answers, the diplomatic responses, the careful phrases designed to maintain professional distance, none of them felt adequate to what Theon was asking. Marcus stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. "Hey, that's pretty personal, don't you think?" But Theon's attention never wavered from Zara. "I apologize if the question causes discomfort, but my people must decide whether to proceed with the deeper alliance your government has proposed. And that decision rests on understanding something fundamental about human nature, about whether your capacity for trust comes from strength or desperation." Neela moved closer, her voice gentle but probing. "Why does that distinction matter to you?" "Because," Theon said, the lights in his skin beginning to pulse in complex patterns, "if humans trust out of fear of isolation, of being left alone in an indifferent universe, then that trust is unstable. It can be withdrawn when fear is replaced by security. But if humans trust out of courage, despite the risk, because connection itself has value, then perhaps we can build something lasting together." The observation deck fell silent, except for the distant hum of the station systems. Zara felt the weight of representation settling on her shoulders, not just speaking for herself but for her entire species. The answer she gave could determine whether humanity and the Vorthak moved forward as true allies or remained forever cautious strangers. She thought about her ex-husband, about the trust she'd given freely only to have it betrayed. She thought about her team, about how she'd learned to rely on Marcus's steady competence and Neela's quiet wisdom. She thought about standing on this deck night after night, looking out at the stars and feeling simultaneously infinite and utterly small. "Both," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We trust because we're afraid of being alone, yes, but we also trust because the alternative is worse than the risk. Being wounded by someone you trusted is painful, but never trusting anyone at all is a kind of death." Theon's rainbow patterns shifted, becoming something like aurora flickering across his skin. "Even when you know the trust might be broken?" "Especially then," Zara said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Because choosing to Trust despite the risk, that's the most human thing we do. It's not logical, it's not safe, but it's what makes us who we are. The silence that followed felt different from the weighted quiet that had preceded it. This silence was full rather than empty, pregnant with possibility rather than doubt. Theon stood motionless for a long moment, and Zara had the impression that something fundamental was shifting inside him, some decision crystallizing in the depths of his alien consciousness. When he spoke again, his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," he said simply. "You have given me the answer my people needed to hear." As he turned to leave, Marcus called after him. "What happens now?" Theon paused at the edge of the deck, his silhouette framed against the star field beyond the windows. "Now we learn whether the Vorthak can find the same courage you humans carry, so naturally. Whether we too can choose connection over safety." He disappeared into the corridor, leaving the three humans alone with the weight of what had just transpired. Zara felt hollowed out and somehow more solid at the same time, as if something essential had been extracted from her and something else equally vital had taken its place. "Well," Marcus said after a long moment, "that was unexpected." Neela was, watching the space where Theon had been, her expression thoughtful. "I don't think we fully understand what just happened here." Zara pressed her palm against the window again, but this time the gesture felt different, less like seeking comfort from the cold glass and more like reaching towards something vast and full of possibility. "Maybe that's okay," she said. "Maybe understanding comes after trust, not before." Outside, the mining drones continued their ancient dance, carving meaning from emptiness, creating something valuable from the raw material of the void. And somewhere in the station's diplomatic quarters, an alien heart carried a human answer toward a future none of them could yet imagine. The real question, Zara realized, wasn't whether they could trust each other. It was whether they were brave enough to find out what came next. The answer in between 6 months had passed since Theon's question echoed through the corridors of Helios 7, and the ripple effects had traveled farther than anyone could have predicted. The Vorthak Confederation had approved the Deep Alliance. Trade routes now connected 17 human colonies to crystalline cities that grew like living jewels on distant worlds, and cultural exchange programs had transformed from cautious experiments into genuine bridges between species. But success, Finn Larson had learned, created its own problems. The cultural attaché stood in the newly constructed diplomatic wing of Luna Station, watching through reinforced windows as the latest Nethys delegation emerged from their aquatic transport. The beings moved through specially designed water-filled corridors with the fluid grace of creatures born to an entirely different kind of existence. Their translucent skin rippled with bioluminescent patterns that served as both communication and art, creating a living language that human linguists were still struggling to decode. "Third delegation this month," Commander Torres observed, joining Finn at the observation window. The station commander carried herself with the particular weariness of someone who'd discovered that peace was often more complicated than conflict. "The Nethys Confederation is pushing hard for expanded territorial agreements." Finn nodded, his attention focused on one figure among the aquatic aliens. Kira moved differently from her companions, where they flowed like water given form. Xiao seemed to fight against her own fluid nature, her movements sharp and deliberate. As the Nethys primary negotiator, she'd been on Luna Station for 3 weeks, and in that time, she'd managed to make herself both indispensable and utterly enigmatic. "Any progress on the territorial dispute?" Torres asked. "That's the thing," Finn said, rubbing his temples. "There shouldn't be a dispute. The terms are generous, the resources abundant, the security guarantees ironclad. By every logical measure, they should have signed the agreement 2 weeks ago. But Kira keeps asking questions that have nothing to do with territory or resources. Yesterday, she spent an hour asking me about human funeral customs. The day before, she wanted to know why we keep photographs of dead relatives." Torres frowned. "Cultural research? Maybe. Or maybe she's trying to understand something else entirely." Finn turned from the window. The Vorthak Alliance succeeded, because Theon found the courage to ask a direct question. "I'm starting to think Kira has a question of her own." but she's approaching it sideways. Down in the aquatic corridors, the Nethys delegation was dispersing to their individual quarters, but Kira lingered, her bioluminescent patterns flickering in what human observers had learned to recognize as contemplation. Even through the reinforced glass and water-filled space, Finn could sense her internal struggle. "Sir?" A young lieutenant approached with the crisp efficiency of someone trying very hard to make a good impression. "Dr. Tanaka is requesting a meeting with you and the Nethys negotiator. She says it's urgent." Finn exchanged glances with Torres. Dr. Yuki Tanaka was Luna Station's resident philosopher, brought in specifically to help navigate the complex ethical and cultural questions that arose from interspecies contact. If she was calling for an urgent meeting, it meant she'd identified something significant. 20 minutes later, Finn found himself in one of the station's multi-environment conference rooms, where atmospheric and aquatic sections were separated by a transparent barrier that allowed face-to-face communication. Kira floated on the other side, her elongated form undulating gently in the water, bioluminescent patches pulsing in slow, hypnotic rhythms. Dr. Tanaka sat across from Finn, her weathered hands folded on the table. At 73, she carried the particular gravity of someone who'd spent decades thinking about the hardest questions existence had to offer. "Thank you both for coming," she began, her voice carrying the measured cadence of academic authority. "I've been observing the negotiation process, and I believe we've been approaching this entirely wrong." Kira's pattern shifted, a ripple of what might have been surprise running through her translucent skin. When she spoke, her voice came through the translation system as a melodic approximation of her aquatic language. "Wrong how, Dr. Tanaka? We've been treating this as a territorial negotiation when it's actually something much more fundamental." Tanaka leaned forward. "Kira, how long have your people been alone?" The question seemed to hit the Nethys negotiator like a physical force. Her bioluminescent patterns flared bright, then dimmed to almost nothing. In the silence that followed, Finn could hear the subtle hum of the water recycling systems. "I don't understand the relevance," Kira said finally, but her light patterns suggested otherwise. "The Nethys Confederation spans 47 water worlds," Tanaka continued gently. "Your civilization is older than humanity by several millennia. You've achieved technological and social advances that we can barely comprehend, but you've never had meaningful contact with another sapient species until now." Kira's form went completely still, a statue of living water suspended in time. "You've been the only voices in your part of the universe for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to be truly heard by someone different from yourself," Tanaka said. "This negotiation isn't about territory. It's about whether you're ready to stop being alone." The words hung in the filtered air of the conference room like a challenge. Finn felt his breath catch as he began to understand what Tanaka was suggesting. The territorial agreements, the resource sharing, the cultural exchanges, all of it was secondary to something much more profound. "The question you're really asking," Finn said, his voice soft with realization, "isn't whether we can share space. It's whether we can share existence." Kira's bioluminescent patterns began to shift, cycling through colors and intensities that the translation system couldn't interpret. When she spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability that Finn had never heard from her before. "My people have been watching you," she said, "watching how you form alliances, how you reach across differences, how you connect. The Vorthak have shared their experiences with your species. They speak of trust, of choosing vulnerability despite risk." She moved closer to the barrier, her form pressing against the transparent wall that separated them. "But we have never been vulnerable. We have never needed to trust anyone outside ourselves. For 3,000 years, we have been complete, self-sufficient, alone. And now," her patterns flickered frantically, "now we discover that alone is not the same as whole." The confession settled over the room like a weight. Finn felt the enormity of what Kira was revealing, an entire civilization confronting the possibility that their self-sufficiency had been a form of isolation they'd never recognized. "What are you afraid of?" he asked. Kira's pattern stilled, Then began a slow, rhythmic pulse that reminded Finn somehow of a heartbeat. That if we open ourselves to your kind of connection, we will lose who we are. That becoming part of something larger will diminish what we have built. She paused, her form shifting in the water. But also that if we don't, we will remain forever incomplete. Dr. Tanaka nodded slowly. The fear of change versus the fear of stagnation. It's one of the oldest philosophical dilemmas. Among your people, perhaps, Kira said. Among mine, it is entirely new. Finn felt a sudden surge of understanding, a recognition that cut through all the formal protocols and diplomatic niceties. You're not just negotiating for your government, he said. You're trying to figure out if your entire species is ready for this. Yes. The word came out as barely more than a whisper through the translation system. And I do not know how to make that determination. Maybe, Dr. Tanaka suggested, that's not your decision to make alone. She stood and moved to a communication panel, her fingers dancing over the controls with practiced efficiency. Within moments, the conference room screens flickered to life, showing connections to stations and colonies across human space. One by one, faces appeared. Diplomats, scientists, philosophers, ordinary citizens who'd volunteered to be part of the expanding network of interspecies dialogue. Dr. Tanaka, came a voice from one of the screens. Is everything all right? More than all right, she replied. We have a question that needs answering, and it's too important for any one person to handle alone. She turned to Kira, whose bioluminescent patterns had intensified with what might have been anxiety or excitement. 6 months ago, a Vorthak diplomat asked a human a question that changed everything between our species. Today, I think it's time for a human to ask a Nethys a question that might do the same. Finn felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. Around him, dozens of human faces looked out from screens, waiting. Across the barrier, Kira floated in her aquatic environment, her entire civilization's future somehow balanced on whatever happened next. Kira, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to ask. If your people join us, really join us, not just as allies but as part of something new, what do you hope we might become together? The question seemed to resonate through the water itself, rippling outward from Kira's form in visible waves. Her bioluminescent patterns began to shift and dance, creating a light show of impossible beauty and complexity. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of wonder that the translation system could barely contain. I hope, she said, that we might become something neither of our peoples could imagine alone. I hope that your capacity for trust and our capacity for depth might create forms of connection that have never existed before. I hope that we might learn to be vulnerable together, and in that vulnerability find a strength that neither isolation nor mere alliance could provide. She moved closer to the barrier again, her patterns now pulsing in rhythm with something that seemed almost like hope. But mostly, she continued, I hope that we might discover that being complete doesn't require being alone. That wholeness can expand to include others without diminishing what we are. The silence that followed was different from the weighted quiet of uncertainty. This was the silence of recognition, of possibilities being born in the space between species. One of the faces on the screens, a farmer from the agricultural colonies, spoke up first. Sounds like you already know what you want, friend. Question is whether you're brave enough to reach for it. Other voices joined in, a chorus of human perspectives offered freely across the vast distances of space. Scientists spoke of the discoveries that might emerge from combining human intuition with Nethys contemplative depth. Artists imagined new forms of beauty born from the marriage of terrestrial and aquatic aesthetics. Philosophers mused about the ethical frameworks that might evolve from truly integrated civilizations. But it was a child's voice that cut through all the complexity with devastating simplicity. Why don't you just try being friends first? Asked a young girl from one of the outer colonies. That's how we always start. Kira's patterns flared bright, then settled into something that looked almost like laughter. Friends, she repeated, as if testing the word. Yes, perhaps that is where all lasting alliances must begin. She turned to Finn, her form graceful even in the confines of her aquatic chamber. I believe my people are ready to try being friends with yours. And perhaps, in time, we will discover what comes after friendship when it grows between species rather than individuals. Dr. Tanaka smiled, the expression carrying decades of philosophical satisfaction. The best questions, she said, are the ones that lead to more questions rather than final answers. As the conference room began to empty and connections closed across space, Finn remained at the barrier, watching Kira's patterns shift through what he was beginning to recognize as contentment. Outside the station's windows, ships from 3 different species moved through the void, no longer strangers but not yet family. Something new and unnamed and full of potential. The universe, it seemed, was becoming a more connected place, one question at a time. And somewhere in the space between courage and fear, between trust and vulnerability, new forms of kinship were being born among the stars. The answer, as always, lay not in the certainty of arrival, but in the willingness to begin the journey together.